This is the No Stroke Podcast with your co-hosts David Dansereau and Michael Garrow, helping you to support and thrive in life after stroke. Their podcast is designed for educational and community support purposes only and should not replace medical treatment and guidance of your own health professional team.
Welcome to episode 32 of the No Stroke Podcast. My name is Dave Dansereau. I'm here with my co-host Michael Garrow. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, David. Thanks for, we're sitting here on the Monday of Labor Day weekend. It's been a busy week for you. Do you want to give the listeners a bit of a feel of kind of what's been going on? It's a big transition in David's life this past week.
Big transition. I'm still digesting the transition of two of my three children going off to college at the same time. So two of my boys got settled into my alma mater. If you're watching the Zoom, Mike, I don't even know if I can put this, looking at my face here. Not sure if I can put this on the YouTube version, but we're recording the audio because we had a great episode. But yeah, big adjustment. Getting, over the holiday weekend here, getting two fine young men, one being our podcast producer, the senior of the two, right? He's going in as a junior and I got a freshman going in, but getting them settled in and running back and forth and finding out all those last minute things on the list we didn't get. So yeah, it's going to be a little different here in the Dansereau home, but it's all good. They're ready to get out and explore this big world of ours. So yeah, how about for you, Mike?
That's exciting. The big send off. You've prepped them well, David. I have no doubt. They're going to be fun young men and ready to experience University of Rhode Island college life.
Yeah. So I thank you, Mike, for that as well. And you do what you can and you get them ready. And that's also my excuse why I don't have any in the news prep, because that's my news. So I put it on your shoulders. So take it away.
Right. So we. In David's absence of in the news, I had to do some homework myself, but we've been talking a lot about Australia the past couple of weeks and the innovation and the care pathways that Australia has really been able to drive from a research perspective, and it's always been a country I've kind of had my eye on, and I think we've looked a lot from the models and some of the folks doing cool things out of Australia. So one thing that popped up this week was a project funded through International Union of Architects, right? And what they're putting out is a challenge for students this year, for all architects all across the globe, it's called the Next Generation of Stroke Rehabilitation Centers. So what they're trying to do is get concepts for what a kind of smaller type building, maybe like 30 stroke survivors, like how to ideally design this to based on the evidence coming out of stroke, based on new technology, really kind of come together. And they've partnered with, it's called the Foley Novel Redesign Group, and they're out of Australia as well. It's like a healthcare redesign and innovation project funded through the University of Melbourne, and really it's a group of like neuroscientists, design architects, researchers that are coming together to try to drive this project forward and possibly like have an evidence-based design for how stroke centers should be created and managed. So I think that would be something really cool to kind of have a sole episode on. I don't know if we have any architects listening to us, but if you have any architects in the family or anyone that might be interested in this, we could list the note, or we'll list the contact info in the show notes here. But yeah, definitely a cool kind of concept of trying to get some students in to really think how we could improve how stroke care is managed and how that in-person rehab design is.
Thanks. That sounds really interesting. Let's get that. And I'd like to get, since I missed it quite a bit this last week, I'd like to get that definitely on our list for in in the show notes. So anything else, or I know we had a great interview earlier with our guest. Do you want to do that intro? Is there anything else I missed in the news?
No, I think I mean, there are some other things that were floating around, but I think that for me is really something that stuck out. Typical research, some other typical research of like, different diets and sleep recommendation, things like that for stroke that we always see. But I think that one was really interesting. And again, just shows, what Australia is pushing for in terms of kind of next generation stroke rehab. So, we do hope, we could get a guest on to talk through that program and some of the other innovation happening in Australia. But yeah, let's jump into this one. So today's guest is Professor Nick Ward. He is a consultant neurologist at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, and also professor of clinical neurology and neuro rehab at Queen Square Institute of Neurology in London. So his special clinical interest is in stroke neuro rehab, focusing particularly on the recovery of the arm and hand function. He's the founder of the Neurorehab Online N-ROL project. He's the co-founder of the UCLP Centre for Neurorehab. He's a co-editor of the Oxford Textbook of Neurorehabilitation, and associate editor of the journals Neurorehab and Neural Repair and Journal of Neurology. So needless to say, this is a busy man. He is one of the most probably covenant, like in terms of research and the papers he's done, and driving forward in research, not only in the UK, but at a global level. He's partnered with, again, a lot of folks over in Australia, and leading the way. And we'll let him talk to it more of why he kind of focusing on the upper arm. But again, it really well researched man, really well respected in the stroke community. So it was an honor to have him on. But yeah, I think guys, like you said, David, it was a long interview. So I think let's just jump into this. It was something that we've had on top for a little while to try to get him in. So I'm glad we were able to make it work. I hope everybody enjoys this one. We'll be back in about a week. We have our next guest. We're going to be recording with the chief medical officer of Hyperfine. So that was a company that we discussed there a couple times over the past month or so that were in the news. So yeah, let's jump into this. Again, if you do like this episode, please subscribe, share with your friends. And if you have anybody in mind that you think would be interesting for us to interview, please reach out and we'll try our best to get them on. So with that, here is Professor Nick Ward, and I hope you all enjoy. Welcome to the No Stroke Podcast, Nick. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. As David and I were doing some research on your past, your involvement within the stroke community, and really the different avenues you've been in. There's a few different places we could start here, but just for our listeners, we gave a brief intro, but can you tell us a little bit about your career and kind of what got you to the point now with University College London?
So thanks. So I'm a neurologist by background, which is kind of interesting because neurologists are often not very interested in rehabilitation. So I'm an unusual neurologist in that sense. I did my training at Queen Square, like a lot of neurologists in London, in the UK. And when it came to research, because as a trainee neurologist, you always end up having to do research. I worked with Richard Frikowiak at the Functional Imaging Lab, which is just across the square from me now. And I was interested, the thing that motivates me is still the thing that motivates me now, is stroke, something like stroke, or even any kind of focal brain injury leads to damage in the brain, essentially leads to a hole. That hole doesn't fill in, and yet people can recover. So how does that happen? It always felt like we should, and it still feels like we should know more about that, because that should hold the keys to being better at treating people. So the thing that I thought back then was that was going to hold the keys was functional brain imaging. So the kind of early part of certainly my research career was in fMRI, looking at how activation patterns in the brain changed as people recovered after they'd had stroke. And at some point I thought, well, this isn't going to get me closer to knowing how to treat people better. And my kind of training as a doctor kind of kicked in, and I thought, well, I'm not doing any treating of people. I was also kind of aware that I'd kind of moved over into this sort of rehab world as a neurologist, and I didn't really have any experience in rehab. So I had to kind of, as a consultant neurologist, I had to kind of get myself trained in rehab. And so I started to do MDT clinics with therapists here at Queen Square. And I basically I'm a good listener, so I listened to them and I learned from them. And at some point, and I can't quite identify where it was, but two colleagues of mine, so Kate Kelly, who's a consultant occupational therapist, and Fran Brando, who's a consultant physiotherapist, we realized we were getting referrals for upper limb, and because upper limb, arm and hand is the thing that I'm interested in because it related to my research. We were getting referrals, and so we'd see people in clinic to give advice about what to do about the upper limb, but you very quickly get frustrated because you don't have a treatment, you don't have a thing. And that's what led us to set up the Queen Square Upper Limb Rehab Program, which has been going for about 8 or 9 years now. So so that's the kind of second part of my career, and I'm kind of waiting to see what the last part has in store. But I've kind of shifted away from doing that kind of functional brain imaging to running an NHS clinical service, but thinking of it very much as an academic service, where that is a place that we should be able to learn lots about recovery of the arm and the hand.
Fascinating. And so we have a strong kind of I would call it an Irish listenership, right? And some folks from the UK, but a lot of our listeners are sitting here in the US. Can you briefly kind of give us a difference of description of the NHS, right, and kind of how that system is set up? I say brief, that it might not be the easiest thing to do briefly, but just for our listeners to kind of understand the way that the NHS is structured.
Well, I think that's a tough question. I mean, essentially the key thing is the NHS is free, and that has consequences,
right,
good and bad. Underfunding, but at the other end, you can get some amazing and incredible services for free. The way it works for us in our program is we're referred patients in from the community. So they have to get referred in by their general practitioner, their family doctor, or by some other specialist team. And then we assess them in a clinic. And then, if we think we can help them on the program, we'll bring them into the program. If we think we can help them in other ways, we'll do that in other ways. But it's all set up. There's no cost to the patient. I guess the reason that's important is because we're not having to justify ourselves to insurance companies. Although, we do think it's very important that we justify the existence of this service, and that's why we have a lot of outcome measures and make sure we try and publish our outcome measures. In terms of the kind of pathway for stroke, I'm not sure that it's hugely different across countries. I mean, what most countries are quite good at is the hyperacute and the acute end, right? So we're good at getting people into stroke units. We're good at deciding whether they need thrombolysis or thrombectomy. We're good at keeping them alive. And then, I was reading a paper from Australia, which again used the phrase that you hear all the time. People feel like they've just fallen off the edge of a cliff and feel abandoned at the moment that they've left hospital, because even though there are wonderful community teams, community rehabilitation teams, there's just not enough of them. They're just completely under-resourced. And as a result, post-stroke rehabilitation is delivered on the basis of available resources rather than on what that person needs, what their kind of biological requirements are, in fact. we just don't, so, and as a result, we're completely underdosing patients. But I think that's true everywhere. We just don't give enough rehab to know what is possible. And I don't see how we can design a rational service unless we have that information, which we currently don't have.
Yeah, Dr. Wood, that's interesting. The amount of resources, certainly in the different phases of recovery and areas you have to focus on. What drew you? I'm curious what drew you to the upper limb and how you got involved in that versus looking at gait or looking at other areas of need for a stroke survivor.
I guess it's relatively practical reasons. I was kind of, as I said, I thought the key to understanding recovery at that time was going to be looking in the brain and how the brain functions. It's much easier to do that with fMRI with the upper limb than it is with gait with legs. So there was a history of using experiments looking at the upper limb. So I was interested in the motor system, and the upper limb seemed easier to study in fMRI, but it turns out it's pretty complicated. So it's fairly pragmatic, to be honest. If opportunities had come along to study, language, for example, like my colleague Alex Leff, maybe I would have gone down that path. Language always seemed really too complicated for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you have a unique stance on a word that we really dislike, but you hear commonly used across the stroke community. It's this word plateau, right? We just had a guest on a couple of weeks ago from Sabo Health. I'm not sure if you're familiar with their technology, but a rehab device for the upper arm. Uh-huh. And they specifically target plateau, saying, this will happen, right? But there's ways to try to get yourself around that. So what's your stance? And, we kind of, with that, the research that you guys are putting out through the lab, like, how are you trying to treat plateau, if you believe in it?
Sure, but I think we first of all have to kind of reframe what saying there is a recovery plateau means. So what you're saying to people, if you use that phrase, what you're saying is beyond about 6 months post-stroke, it is no longer possible for there to be any clinical improvement. Full stop. In any domain: movement, upper limb, gait, cognition, language. And that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's kind of deeply upsetting and kind of insulting to many stroke survivors who know that you can continue to improve way beyond that. So why have we, but actually, if you look at data, so this idea of the plateau has come from those recovery curves, right? So they go up, and then around about 6 months, they kind of flatten off. And actually, if you follow people up for longer, if you follow people up for 5 years, they start to go down. So there is a European study that shows us that by about 5 years post-stroke, people are back to where they were 2 months post-stroke. So the question is always, is that a biological inevitability, or is there something that we can do about that? So that's always the challenge. So I think the key thing, and again, I start to emphasize this in talks that I do, is that this idea about the plateau, if we're going to talk about it, we're really only talking about the level of impairment. So if you think about the ICF, about all the possibilities, do we think that beyond 6 months, it is no longer possible to help somebody at the level of participation through some kind of, aid or, mobility scooter? That makes no sense at all. You can always help people at the level of participation. Can you help people at the level of activity? Well, you probably can. You can probably always help people at the level of activity indefinitely. Okay, so the idea of a plateau is like immediately banished. So if we're then talking about impairment, then we can cut across domains and go, okay, well, what about, so we've got, let's think, motor, language, cognition. So the debate is really mostly in the motor domain and mostly at the level of impairment. The language people don't seem to have this problem. They're pretty happy with the idea that improvement in aphasia, in comprehension, but particularly in expression, can continue for years after stroke. And in cognition, we probably just don't have enough data, to be honest. But You know, people will say that cognition is something that improves slower than the other domains and for longer, but that's probably because we just don't treat it or even recognize it in many cases. So just picking it apart, the plateau idea is really a motor impairment issue, but it has been applied to the whole of stroke, and stroke services seem to have been designed entirely on the basis of the plateau. It's like it's an excuse for withdrawing, it's a justification for withdrawing treatment for beyond 6 months. Well, the plateau says that there won't be any improvement, therefore why would we treat you? It doesn't make any sense. You have to think about it very long for it to not make any sense. So then if you're talking about the motor system and you're talking about impairment, then it becomes more interesting, right? So I would say that there are data now that say you can take chronic stroke patients and that they can change in the Fugl-Meyer. So the Fugl-Meyer assessment is supposed to be a measure of impairment, okay? So in the upper limb program, you know, we change people at the level of Fugl-Meyer. The mean or the median time post-stroke is 21 months in our program. You look at the studies from people like Janice Daly, you know, delivering 300 hours of some form of upper limb treatment to chronic stroke patients. They get similar big changes. So if the Fugl-Meyer is a measure of impairment, then yes, you know, impairment can be changed in the chronic phase. Now we're kind of really getting to the kind of scientific nitty-gritty. Now, some people might then say, well, maybe the Fugl-Meyer isn't really a true measure of impairment. And actually what you really need to be looking at is motor control. But, you know, see how far away we've already come from the original idea of the plateau. We're now asking the question, is it possible for motor control to improve in the chronic state? And you know, so there are some studies that look at kinematics to assess motor control. So in other words, you're getting people to do a motor task that you can't cheat at. So if you improve at that task, it implies that there is some improvement in your ability to control your movements. You're not just cheating, you're not just doing trunk leaning, or you're not just getting stronger, for example. That does happen, but if you follow people up very early, it seems to stop at about 8 to 12 weeks. But nobody's ever looked at or given high enough doses of treatment to people in the chronic phase. So we are collecting those data now in our upper limb patients going through the program. We're collecting kinematic data. And if we show that chronic stroke patients with a big enough dose of high quality, high intensity rehab can be changed at the level of motor control, then I think that just blows the doors off the whole plateau thing. That would be my take on it, briefly.
Can you dive a little deeper into the specific design of your program and the dosing?
Sure. So I'll kind of preface it by saying that the design of our program works for us at Queen Square in central London. You know, it may be that in the Australian outback or, you know, somewhere else, you have a different model. Absolutely happy with that idea. So, well, when we first started it, so we kind of just sort of snuck it under the radar. And Kate and Fran, who I mentioned before, who I still run this program with, they basically had to start treating patients on top of their normal jobs. So that was, you know, heroic work from them. And we started off having this idea that we would have 2 different programs. We'd have a 2-week program and a 4-week program, and very quickly went, okay, this isn't going to work. So pragmatically, you know, we said, okay, 3 weeks. It's a bit like, where does 45 minutes for a session come from? It's probably because an hour is too long and half an hour is not long enough. So we kind of, we tried 3 weeks, and it enabled us to write a business case in a way that was understandable and, you know, and get it funded that way. And it felt about right. So we see people in clinic, if we think that they're going to benefit from high dose, high intensity treatment training, which involves physiotherapy and occupational therapy, we'll bring them into the program. 3 weeks, 5 days a week, timetabled for 6 hours a day. Now that doesn't mean that they get 6 hours of active time on task. When we did, we had a student do some observations about 100 hours of patient sessions, and worked out that probably about 50% of that time was active time on task. which actually I was kind of horrified at first. I thought it wasn't enough, but actually, if you think about it, it's about right. So that's actually doing something with the upper limb in it may be a functional task, it may not be a functional task, it doesn't matter, but they were moving the upper limb. And then, you know, the rest of the 50% is taken up with between session rests, within session rests, working on gait, doing some cardiovascular, maybe sensory training, education. So there's lots of other things that go on. So they work with a physio and with an OT, and then we have a rehab assistant. The staff to patient ratio is very good. It's 1-to-1. And when they get, and you know, it's very much based on what their individual goals are, but the philosophy is essentially understanding what the problem is with that person's arm. We always say, why does that person's arm not work? So that's essentially diagnostics. That's the first key thing that is really important. Why does that arm not work? Secondly, individualized goals. Thirdly, loads and loads and loads of practice. Fourth, promoting self-efficacy, giving patients the understanding, the tools, the knowledge, the skills, the hope that they can continue to take this on and do well when they go home. So then we see them at 6 weeks to follow them up, really to make sure that they haven't run into any problems with, you know, practical things. And then we do a final follow-up at 6 months. We'd love to follow them up for longer, but you know, this is an NHS service. And at each of the time points, so admission, discharge, 6 weeks, 6 months, we do a whole battery of outcome measures, which culturally was quite a difficult thing for me to impose on the team, because it's not usual to do quite so many outcome scores. But you know, we do Fuggemeier, we do ARAT, we do the KE, we do ARMA A, ARMA B, we do, you know, stroke impact scale, we do fatigue scores, we've got sensory scores, you know. But it was really important from my point of view. You know, I felt it's such a privilege for us to be able to run this program at a place like Queen Square, that we really, you know, our obligation was to collect data and where possible publish data, so that we can try and get a toe in the door for everybody else to do something similar. So, you know, if somebody said, well, you know, we're not going to run it that way, we're going to spread, you know, maybe we do the same number of hours, but we're going to spread it over 3 months. Great, that would be absolutely fine. Just measure it, measure stuff, see whether it works. When COVID came along, the team were amazing. They just created a completely online version of our upper limb program. Never been done before. Made it 4 weeks. So it's 4 weeks, 80 hours, sessions like this. You know, thought, how do you do that? But again, we made sure we measured stuff. So people actually had to come in on day, I think they came in on day 3, because the therapist said, we're not going to do this without actually being able to assess what the problem is. I need to know whether they've got a painful shoulder when I move. I need to know what the tone feels like there in order to be able to work with somebody in their own kitchen. But it allowed us to do all those quantitative outcome measures as well. And although I haven't done all of the analysis, you know, people do improve, probably not quite as much as the face-to-face, but you know, but they do improve. So, you know, there are all kinds of ways that you can do this. You know, the bottom line is we just don't give a big enough dose. You know, and it's not, even though, you know, we talk about intensity, and I've had this discussion recently with people on the national clinical guidelines, people get mixed up between dose and intensity. And it's not, you know, we don't have any direct evidence that intensity is the key thing, but there's lots of evidence that dose is important. Just doing more is important. Lots of evidence. But it doesn't, we're finding it very difficult to get that into national clinical guidelines. I don't know what it's like in other countries. So that's what the program is. That works for Queen Square. Key thing is, as I said, the key ingredients for me are the diagnostics, understanding why the arm doesn't work, because that allows you to clinically reason. I mean, this is what therapists do anyway, okay, but it's kind of quantifying it. Individualized goals, mass practice, self-efficacy. That's what we think the active ingredients of our program are. And that's why when they go home and we measure them at 6 weeks and 6 months, they don't just go down. Like lots of people told us they would. They said, why are you setting this program up? You'll improve them in 3 weeks and then they'll just go back to where they were. Well, they don't. And probably the reason that they don't is because the commonest thing that people said to us when they were discharged or at the end of the 3 weeks was, oh, I get it now. I understand, I know what I'm supposed to do. And I think that's why they maintain.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the more we talk to folks in this space, you know, that dose is so important, right? And I think it goes back, you know, you look at the way stroke rehab's reimbursed. It's reimbursed by session, right? So we're not actually saying you need this many reps. It's more so you're getting this X amount of sessions. We always have a thing that we say, you know, from stroke survivors' point of view, like you need to train like an athlete, right? And it's, you know, that 10,000 reps, you know, it's continuous, you know, development, and, you know, and for it's a lifelong thing. I'd love to kind of dive more into this rehab in the home kind of point of kind of where you guys are currently, because it seems like, you know, you've developed this great program, you know, it's an intensive 3-week period that they're getting this treatment, and then you're having this follow-up. Where, in your perspective, like, where are you seeing the biggest drop off? Is it like motivation? Is it keeping up like new types of exercises to do? Like, where is that lacking? Because you see these companies that are coming out, like Grip Able. I know they're a UK company that are, you know, building a device, and, you know, companies like Sabo as well. But what's that missing link that you think is still having folks, once they go home, they're just falling again, they feel like they're falling off that cliff? You know, is there that next step?
Sure. Well, if you listen to you know, the comment that a lot of patients make when they leave the program, that they get it, now they know what to do. I mean, that tells you that for many people, and this is, you know, and I hear this in clinic all the time when we're assessing people who come in, who are referred into by community teams, they don't know what it is they're supposed to be doing. They're not sure. So there's uncertainty. There's uncertainty about what they ought to be doing. And they're trying, you know, their best. And you see these people who have set up gyms in their garage, and they're doing strength training. You know, unfortunately, they're usually strengthening the muscles that are not weak, rather than the ones, because they're, you know, they're just trying so hard. They don't quite know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. But we also have a tremendous amount of uncertainty about what people's potential is, right? And patients they don't know what to expect. They don't know how far they can go. And we don't have the tools yet to do that. I mean, I think it's not, I mean, it's kind of very tangentially related to your question, which I'll come back to. But I think having much better prognostics, like, where should this person be at this point in their recovery? Like, oh, it looks like they've dropped off. Why is that? Oh, because they're not doing anything, because they don't believe it's going to work. Okay, we need to go into that. Or maybe they've, you know, we see so many people in clinic now who've got a frozen shoulder. It seems to, I don't know why it's increasing. I tweeted this out the other day, and I was hoping people could tell me why, because they don't seem to be getting treated. But, you know, people who've got nice finger movement, but they've got a frozen shoulder, and being told, well, you've had a stroke. What do you expect? Those people have got fantastic potential to get really good working hands and arms back, because they've already got finger movement back, but they can't. So showing people what it is that they need to do, avoiding complications, you know, is really important. But your question was more related to the role of technology, I think. So how can we use technology in the home to get people doing more stuff? So that's a tough market, right? I mean, these people are not going into this market to become billionaires, are they? I don't think so. Good on them. That's the first thing. And I think the key thing that we have to remember when we're looking at, you know, these devices is rehabilitation is a complex intervention. So what do I mean by that? I don't mean it's complicated and it's, you know, impossible to describe and it's mysterious. I mean, it's complex in that it has multiple components and they interact with one another. So we've talked a lot about what some of those components are, you know, just, you know, even simply, you know, diagnostics, individualized goals, mass practice, self-efficacy. So devices that get you to do stuff with a kind of attached to a game on a tablet or on a screen are fine. We just have to remember that isn't rehab. So devices like that, and the same goes for robotics, are fine, but they are things that are targeting impairment. So we need to think about those as these are things that could be incorporated into an overall program when you want to target a specific impairment. And then if you think about them like that, they're fine. It's just when people start doing clinical trials of device versus physio, it doesn't make any sense. And it's not what rehab programs are. So I think they're all, I mean, people generally come in and say that they've got one of these things and they generally like them. I mean, occasionally they don't like them, but it's probably because there's a mismatch between what that person needs to be working on and what that device is good for, whether it's fingers or whether it's for reaching or whether it's pronation, supination or whatever. So we in our field need to be much better at matching up devices, whether it's simple home-based things or it's the kind of more complex things that we see in rehab units, understanding what it is that we're trying to do with those. How do you match up the patient and the thing that you want to work on with the device? And we're just not very good at that. And the companies know that too. If for example, and it took us a long time, so we do have some devices, but it might be, you're trying to do something with somebody in the kitchen, and they've got a particular weakness in reaching. You go, okay, we need to work on that impairment. Let's get you into that device. You're going to do reps in that. We need to strengthen. We need to get some better control there. Then we'll take you back into the kitchen. But we have to be able to understand where those devices fit into the overall package of rehab. And that's why it kind of infuriates me when I see clinical trials of device versus therapist. It's not an interesting question, and it doesn't help us build, more comprehensive services.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think it'll never replace it. It could only support and kind of up that dose. But sorry for cutting in, David. Go ahead.
No, I just it's really well said. The tech at the right time, and that's I've always explained to my patients too: is it high tech you need right now or high touch? Do you need that education? Because the more experts like yourself, Nick, that we have come on, the more refreshing it is, and the message that I think is so important is that we talk around neuroplasticity, the opportunity for the brain to stop learning, that does not stop. It's just, I'm motivated by that stat that you said early on in our discussion about why is it that after 5 months folks fall back to baseline? Is it lack of support, service, motivation? It's a complex mix or a recipe that we, like folks like yourself that are looking at measuring the outcomes, even with I'm impressed that even with your online neuro recovery program that you pivoted to during the pandemic, I imagine it's what maybe jump-started it, that you mentioned that you're bringing folks back in so they are still getting those measurable touch points, because it is motivating for the patient to actually know, even if it's subtle changes, are those changes actually still happening?
Yeah, well, as long as it's changing.
True.
No, but that is the thing. There are some scores that we use. I mean, the ARAT in particular, with people with quite, whose hands are not, very difficult to use. It's tough. And we do have people who kind of refuse to do the outcomes because they find it too upsetting at the end because they feel like they went and changed.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect example right there, because then maybe there's a new tool at that point that you keep trying, kind of like as a coach, going back to Mike's theme around the sport and the performance side, like maybe it's a nudge in a little subtle different direction, and just to until you find out maybe what might work.
Sure, for that person. Yeah.
So one thing that I think has certainly grown through the like in light of the pandemic, I suppose, is online education and support, right? And that's something you guys leaned into outside of the physical rehab itself, is a partnership with SameU and Emilia Clark. So I know that's, it's a foundation that's grown quite rapidly over the last, couple of years since it's begun in the UK. And, I think my following of the Stroke Association, actually, from the UK perspective, like there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of support within those two foundations, but particularly with your work with SameU and the Neurorehab Online program. Can you speak more to that and kind of some of the success and the groups that you guys are running there currently?
So yeah, so we've been in contact with SameU for about 3 years now, obviously interrupted by the pandemic, and our conversations are really around how we can, do something transformational in the field of neuro recovery for people with acquired brain injury, be it stroke or traumatic brain injury, across domains, movement, language, cognition, emotional support. So that's a big, undertaking, but it's something that, that really needs to be done. When the pandemic came along, so Jenny Clark, who's CEO of SameU, said to me, we want to do something COVID related, but we want it to be in the field of rehab, and we think we can raise some money. So obviously Jenny and Amelia did raise some money, and so I had to think of something to do with it. so I struggled for a couple of days, but there's some amazing people around here at Queen Square, and this idea of tele-rehab was kind of there because we realized very quickly that people with stroke were probably not going to, we didn't realize that not so many of them would go to hospital, but we knew that people would not be in hospital as long. They would get discharged quickly. They would not be getting as much inpatient rehab as they normally get. And even though I'm always, saying that people get hardly any community rehab, they were going to get even less just because it wasn't possible for the community team. So there's going to be a whole cohort of people experiencing stroke during that time who were going to get shortchanged. It's like, well, what can we do? How can we help those people? And so my first brainwave I had was when I was talking to a PhD student of mine called Ben Beer, who is a amazing physiotherapist. And as I was talking to him, I realized that his PhD program was going to have to stop for about 6 months. And I thought, well, why don't I get Ben involved in doing tele-rehab? And then my second brainwave was when about a minute later, I bumped into Catherine Dugan, who is an amazing clinical neuropsychologist who works here at Queen Square, and thought she would be a great partner for Ben. And so we basically, who was also doing a research project at the time, so we seconded them out of their research projects for 6 months with the funding that Jenny and Amelia raised, and we set up N-ROL. And it was, it was an amazing time because I think we're all kind of forgetting what that time was like. It was like we were on a war footing. London was empty. I was coming in here, we were turning research labs into TV studios. We set up these big television screens, and we had to work out, we had to connect with the community team to say, refer patients to us. And then we'll set up some groups. And because I had a physio and a clinical neuropsychologist, we were quite ambitious. So we did groups for gait and balance. We did groups for upper limb. We did cognitive rehab. We got speech and language therapists over from the unit to run some sessions for aphasia. We had fatigue management groups, and Catherine ran a carers cafe. And they also had me and Alex Leff, who's also a consultant neurologist here at Queen Square, who works on the ICAP service, which is basically doing for aphasia what we do for upper limb, an intensive 3-week aphasia program. She would have us do meet the doctor sessions where we would, talk to people. The idea there was we wanted people to get all their questions about what am I supposed to be on this drug? What does this drug do? I've got this symptom in my leg. We wanted to get those out of the way so that when they were in sessions with Ben or Catherine or whoever, it wouldn't come up. The other thing that we had to do was, we thought, well, this is going to be a disaster if people keep dropping off the call, or they can't, they don't know how to use the internet, or the Wi-Fi doesn't work. So this amazing guy called Pedro Kirk came and volunteered to work with us, and he ran the IT side of things. So he would call up patients before sessions and make sure that they could get online, and he would watch each of the sessions, and if somebody dropped off, then Ben or Catherine didn't have to stop the session. He would then phone them up and say what's happened, and go, it's okay, George has not fallen off his chair, it's just his, you know, somebody's arrived at the door and he's or whatever. And yeah, we ran it that way. So yeah, so those three in particular ran themselves into the ground for it. But again, the ethos was not just let's create a whole neuro rehab service online, but let's measure it, let's assess it. You know, it's always, if you're going to get, again, the privilege of being able to do something like this, you have to measure it. Otherwise, you know, what's the point? So we weren't able to bring people in to do a whole range of different outcome measures. Some of the services did kind of domain specific measures, but overall, you know, our hypothesis was that if we connect with people in this way, the thing that will have an effect on will be self-efficacy. So our primary outcome measure there was the stroke self-efficacy questionnaire, and self-efficacy did improve in those patients, and that's what we published. The other really good thing that we did was to write down what the program is. So, you know, people who work in the research field will know this, that when you have an intervention, there is a way of describing that intervention using the TIDIA guidelines, so that if you gave those guidelines to some other service, to some other unit, and they followed exactly what's written down, then they would be doing the same thing. So we wrote down the TIDIA guidelines of what the whole of the N-ROL program was and published those in JNNP, so that anybody can download them, have a look at them, compare what they're doing to what we're doing. I mean, they may disagree with what we did, that's absolutely fine, but it's there, so it's not mysterious what we did. So I think that was also a really valuable thing. So
it's
yeah,
amazing. Is that still being funded? Are you guys, is that program still running? Or
yeah, so phase 2 of that was, you know, for something like this, you start to think, okay, we need to get this sort of thing in front of commissioners in the NHS, so they will go, okay, we're going to pay for this to be part of the NHS. So it was going to be very difficult for us to do that down here in London. So I know a wonderful academic physiotherapist up at the University of Central Lancashire called Louise Connell, and I contacted her, and they took on N-ROL from London and they shifted up to East Lancashire. And again, SAMU really, you know, pulled through for them and have raised quite a bit of money to allow them to continue to do that, because they're doing more outcome scores than we did, testing the efficacy of this intervention, testing the feasibility of it, and they're doing it in the context of a real NHS service and under the noses of the commissioners, so that, you know, they may get some traction with commissioners, and people can see how it might be useful in a future model of community-based, you know, post-discharge stroke rehabilitation. Because you can see how you could end up with some kind of really nice hybrid model of community teams seeing people, but then also being able to access people in their own homes when it suits them more, and that would be great. So that's the kind of thing that they're working on. Louise is very, you know, she's particularly interested in the difficulties that you have in taking an intervention, even when you've demonstrated efficacy, and how you translate it into real clinical practices. So that's incredibly valuable work that she is continuing to do with her colleagues up at University of Central Lancashire, which is continued to be funded by SAMU.
That's brilliant. And you know, I know in my involvement in like the Irish system for stroke, there is a program called the Early Supported Discharge program. Is that kind of, would you see this program kind of tied into something of that model, or is it a little different?
Yeah, I mean, early supported discharge is something that was studied about 25 years ago. So the original papers were published, and the goal there was to say that if we give the same amount of rehab, whatever that is, in people's own, that they're getting in hospital, but we give it to people in their own homes, what effect will it have? And the hypothesis there was not about outcomes, it was not about recovery, it was about saving you know, time in hospital, it was saving bed days, and what they were interested in was to make sure it wasn't worse. So it wasn't worse, but people didn't do any better. But it had quite, you know, it had quite strict inclusion and exclusion criteria for what ESD is. So no, ESD runs throughout the whole of the UK, or it's supposed to run throughout the whole of the UK. I couldn't give you the percentage of regions in which it runs, and I couldn't give you the percentage of regions in which it runs in the way that it was originally described, but that will be a lot less. So ESD became a byword for rehabilitation. It was a way of getting people out of hospital early. So actually the inpatient stays dropped, and then ESD teams come in quite early, and then people may wait for a bit more community rehab. You know, but ESD is still, you know, completely underdosing people in terms of what they need. It's not their fault, it's just not enough of them. But so that's right. Not N-ROL is trying to increase dosing.
Yeah. Okay, nice. I know, David, you know, we usually try to end on our favorite question of the day, around the magic wand. But David, anything, you know, that you want to touch on before we wrap things up here?
Yeah, I'm really impressed by the how you removed all the barriers. I feel like I could talk to you more about your neuro online program alone, just for, it looks like you built on the fly, quite the Peloton community and model around, you know, supporting stroke survivors during that period. And I hope that continues to grow, and I'm going to look more at that model as well.
It was partly because the red tape had gone because of COVID.
Yeah.
That's why we could just do stuff without really asking people. That's why it worked.
I hope it continues to work, because I think there's a nice hybrid model there that we're still on tap. So I think, because we are coming to the top of the hour here, Mike, I'm going to hand off the famous magic wand question to you, and we'll put any show notes or any resources to follow in our package here, so that folks can reach out if they have any questions. But Mike, take it away on the magic wand.
Cool. All right. So I know you've done some magic already, Nick, for folks here in the stroke community. But if we were to hand you, and I think David now in the video, do you have the actual magic wand?
Oh, nice.
There. Yeah. I mean, we're working on it. It's a low budget production here, Nick, but you know, we'll work on it. If we were to hand you a magic wand, and you had the ability to redesign the stroke care pathway, you know, what would that look like for you?
I mean, we talked about a lot of the things already, haven't we? I think we need, you know,
Yeah.
I would love to have better diagnostics, like more focus on like, what's wrong with this person? Then if we could have better prognostics, and we could really try and make some accurate predictions about where people might be, so that we can kind of target how to treat them a bit better, that would be great. Early rehab is really important. Generally, that's focusing on avoiding complications at the moment. And then by the time you get people home, we need to work out ways of increasing the dose. So that's, you know, that's absolutely critical. And I don't know exactly what those are at the moment, but it might involve hybrid, it might involve doing all these other things. The thing we haven't talked about though is, so this is all great, you know, understand what the clinical problem is, treat people, give them big doses of high quality training. But at some point, people are going to hit a ceiling. There is going to be a limit to what they can achieve, because of they've lost particular parts of the brain or particular bits of white matter, the cortical spinal tract being, you know, really important in the upper limb. And so the other thing that the kind of neuroscience world is interested in is this concept of repair. So repair doesn't mean like filling in the hole, but it means getting people back towards a more normal pattern of behavior. And it seems that that's achievable in those first 2 or 3 weeks. Again, this is another reason that the plateau word comes up. But remember, we've kind of framed that in terms of impairment. So behavioral repair, getting back towards normal, seems to require these underlying biological changes that you see in the very early phase. And maybe those go away, and maybe behavioral repair is not possible later on. I don't know, but we could just have a much better understanding about those processes and have some tools that were able to do repair. I mean, I don't think we quite know what we mean by repair, but it involves plasticity. It involves doing things at the level of the cortex, probably at the level of the brainstem nuclei, probably at the level of the spinal cord as well when it comes to the motor system. Then I think that's also going to be really, that's the sort of thing that could be truly transformative. The doing the dose thing is something that we kind of know already, but it's a resource issue, not a neuroscience issue.
That's true. And I know that's something that you're also working on. Is it the ARM lab that we didn't really touch on, that is kind of some of the more neuroscience specific, like brainstem stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, so ARM Labs is a collaboration between me and my friend and colleague, Sven Bessman. So we have some overlapping interests. And so we decided to kind of bring our labs together so that the students could learn from each other. So we're trying to make the focus of a lot of the work, the upper limb program. So making sure the patients who come into that program are also available to participate in research studies, whether it's something to do with brain stimulation and looking at current modeling to see where the current goes, or looking at the balance between corticospinal tract and reticular spinal tract in particular people, or EEG or structural imaging markers or kinematics of movement. So we're interested in all of those things, and we're trying to use the upper limb as the resource for that.
Interesting. It sounds like you should build get a resort out in London, so stroke survivors from all over could kind of tap into this opportunity.
I think that's a great idea. Finally, the other, because the other thing is we talked about the clinical side, we talked about the neuroscience side, but of course, like fixing people after stroke or getting help promoting their recovery is not just going to be a biomedical problem. We also need to be engaging with engineers, computer scientists, designers. I've just come off a call with people from the Bartlett UCL School of Architecture, thinking about how you design environments within which people their recovery can be promoted. So I think there are so many smart people around that we really need to tap into those people, because recovery from stroke and brain injury is probably the hardest problem in clinical neuroscience. We really need the smartest, the cleverest, the best people in all of those disciplines to come and focus on this problem. That's how big and how challenging it is, but also how exciting it is. This is where all the smart people should be wanting to work.
Yeah, well said, Nick, and certainly stroke recovery does take a team. And what's the best way for folks to reach out? You seem to be pretty active on Twitter. Is there a best way to, and just wrapping up, is there a best way for folks to reach out to you?
Sure, my email's out there. I think it's pretty easy to find, or direct messaging on Twitter, I guess. I don't look at those so often, but.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we definitely have your email, so we'll pop that in the show notes. But yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again for your time today, and hopefully we could do this again soon, because I think there's a lot more we could dive into.
Yeah, thanks guys. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nick.